Bienvenidos, bienvenidas una vez más al Laboratorio Filosófico del Decrecimiento. Bienvenido, Jean-Baptiste, al Laboratorio Filosófico. Es un espacio interdisciplinar dedicado a politizar la historia ambiental de la crisis ecológica e iluminar el camino de la transición justa. Es un auténtico placer tenerte hoy con nosotros. Muchas gracias por haber aceptado la invitación.
Gracias, Alberto.
Bueno, para quien no conozca a nuestro invitado de hoy, Jean-Baptiste Fressoz es historiador de la ciencia, la tecnología y el medio ambiente. Es profesor de la Escuela de Altos Estudios de Ciencias Sociales de París y acaba de publicar Sin Transición, una nueva historia de la energía, editado por Soil y que va a ser traducido y publicado en español por la editorial ARPA. También es autor de Las Revueltas del Cielo, una historia del cambio climático del siglo XV al siglo XX, donde reconstruye las distintas formas en que el cambio climático ha estado presente en las preocupaciones políticas del ser humano mucho antes de que éstas se concretaran en torno a los gases del efecto invernadero. Otro de tus libros, coescrito junto a Christophe Bonnuil, el acontecimiento antropoceno o l'événement anthropocène, La Tierra, la Historia y Nosotros, del año 2013, fue traducido al inglés como The Shock of the Anthropocene, y lo recomendamos encarecidamente a quien quiera abordar los debates políticos en torno a la noción del antropoceno. En 2012 publicaste El Apocalipsis Alegre, una historia del riesgo tecnológico, donde rescatas una buena parte de los debates ambientales que ya se daban en el siglo XVIII y XIX. Y bueno, antes de comenzar, queríamos recordar que Jean-Baptiste Fressoz estará en el Reina Sofía el 17 de junio dialogando sobre su último libro junto a Adrián Almazán. Será de 7 a 9 en el edificio Nouvel, Auditorio 200 del Reina Sofía. Y ahora, si te parece bien, vamos a cambiar a inglés para facilitar la conversación y para quien lo necesite, este es el momento de activar los subtítulos. Okay, thanks again, Jean-Baptiste, to be here. The first question that I want to make you is the obligatory one. How is it possible that the energetic transition, of which we have been told so much, has not yet begun?
I think the main reason it's because it's not a very scientific notion. This idea of energy transition is not grounded on a serious understanding of the material and energy dynamics happening in the real world. Um, it's because good or bad reasons, there is, of course, a tendency to produce like more aspirational discourse,
Mm-hmm.
facing climate change, we just have to do an energy transition out of fossil fuels in 20 years now. So this is really a very strange story and a very strange notion. And the stranger thing is that this weird notion has become so consensual. Energy transition is the future of serious people, of reasonable people. This is the future of corporations. This is the future of politicians, the future of governments, and it's also the future of experts.
Yeah,
If
in your book
that's
you said something very interesting that also the IPCC is really conditioned by this scheme.
yeah, I mean, I in the IPCC, we got several groups, and the third group is working on the solutions, what we have to do basically. And when you read their last report, which is from 2022, it's a big PDF file of over 2,900 pages. Transition is all over the place. There are more than 2,700 occurrences of the word transition. And it's very interesting because you have to compare that with other words. For instance, degrowth is virtually absent
Mm-hmm.
in this report, only 20 times. It appears only 20 times. And sufficiency is also it's quite marginal. I mean, 200 occurrences compared to more than 2,000 occurrences for transition. If you take the word demand management, which was the older way of talking about sufficiency in the previous reports, it has always been very marginal compared to technological solutions. So yes, I mean, the experts are very much They are more or less only interested in technological solutions. It's really the main topic of this report is technological transition. And even more strange, in some part of the report, you can see that they have in their mind a transitionist vision of the past. What I mean is, in the chapter 2, you can see, you can read sentences such as, the energy transition must occur faster than the previous ones, than the previous energy transitions.
Okay.
It's really weird because
Yes, it is.
we all know that for the moment there has been no energy transition, right? We have not passed the peak consumption of coal, the peak consumption of oil, the peak consumption of wood. I mean, all energy sources have grown in history.
Yes,
We have not transitioned from one energy to another. This is not the right narrative.
and that's the focus of the book. To make it more clear, in a general sense, your whole book is directed against a history structured in phases. Let's say
Yeah.
from wood to coal to oil to renewable energies. That is what you call fascism in Francais. That is not fascism, is from phases.
Yeah.
And
Stagism would be the translation.
aestheticism, okay, is the scheme you reject in favor of a symbiotic view of energy history. So, where does this understanding of history come from, and why it's so confusing, and how this symbiotic conception can replace it?
Okay, so several questions.
Yes, sorry.
Well, about the historiography, it's true that if you read like the standard books on the history of energy, you've got this very stagist narrative of energy. This book, they're structured around the same plan. Basically, you've got the first chapters, which are dealing with wood, hydraulic energy, uh, uh, beasts of burden, traditional energies. And then you've got the central chapters, which are about coal and the Industrial Revolution, steam engine, right? And the chapters on the 20th century will be mainly dealing about oil and the diesel engine or the motor car. But this is a very narrow way of framing the history of energy, because as I guess renewables have expanded tremendously during the Industrial Revolution. In the 19th century, industrializing countries are consuming more and more wood for their energy. They're consuming more water power for their energy. There is more human muscle in the economy during the 19th and the 20th centuries. You've got more humans working in the fields, working in the industries, working in the mines. I mean, all these energies have increased with industrialization and with coal and with oil. They have not decreased, right? So this is really the first point. I mean, we should not focus on the new at each epoch, but we should focus on all the energies at each epoch. This is a key point which had been rightly underlined by a very important British historian of technology called David Edgerton, who made the same point about the history of tech. Historians of technology have been obsessed with innovation, with the new at each epoch, and not all the technology which are used at each epoch. And for instance, coal, it is well known that, I mean, the great era of coal is certainly not the 19th century. It is the late 20th, early 21st centuries. It's right now that we are hopefully passing the peak coal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just to give you a statistics, 95% of the coal that has been burnt throughout history has been burnt after 1900 in the 20th and 21st century. 86% of the coal has been extracted out of Europe. But if you look at the historiography, most of the books and articles are about coal in the 19th century in Western Europe, and especially in Britain. But it's certainly not it's not where the important things do happen. I mean, like Australia or Indonesia, right now, they are extracting twice as much coal as Britain or the US in the 1900s, the two giants of the coal of the 1900s. So the first point is just to look at really this history of energy, not focusing on the new and not focusing on the technology as well. I mean, we have to look at materials. And the second point, when you look at the material history of energy, you see that all the energies are closely interconnected, intertwined. And that's why I said we really have to study the symbiotic dimension in the energy history. I'll just give you an example. In the standard history of energy, there is this idea that the Industrial Revolution in Britain was a transition, an energy transition from wood to coal. And it is true that around 1900s, Britain did not use wood anymore to produce steel, or did not use wood anymore to heat the houses, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the mines, you see that Britain is extremely dependent on wood. I mean, Britain in 1900s consumed 4.5 million cubic meters of pit props, made of wood, of course, to extract coal. In comparison, Britain in the 18th century burned 3.5 million cubic meters of fuel wood, right? So industrial Britain of the 20th century consumed more wood to produce its energy than Britain of the 18th century. So it's certainly not a transition. It's a much more complex history where energies and materials are completely intertwined, where it's very difficult to disconnect one energy from the other. And the same thing goes with coal and oil. I mean, you cannot tell the story of the 20th century as a transition from coal to oil. It doesn't work at all. But you got books which are making this point, right?
Yes, absolutely. One thing that I consider extremely important from your book is you prove that material history dismantles the canonic structure of historical thought. Let's say now you explain that we tend to think that the coal is the industrial revolution of the 19th century, and then you prove like from the 1980 to 2010 is the period which has the biggest consuming history. So in this sense, would you say that the industrial revolution is not an event, but a permanent dynamic of the present?
Oh yeah, of course we are still in the industrial revolution. I mean, on a global scale. I mean, we are industrializing nowadays. I mean, we have never been as industrial as now. I mean, at a global level, the number of workers in the industry has risen in the 20th century and the 21st century in the world because there are more humans and we are producing more stuff. But if you take the example of coal, I think it's striking to see that between 1980 and 2010. Coal consumption has tripled. And this is, I mean, coal is really a kind of new energy when you think about it properly. Coal power plants in Asia are very young. They are 12 years old on average. Nuclear plants, on the other hand, are very old. On average, they're more than 30 years old, right? So coal is really a key technology for the 21st century. It remains essential in the production of energy. And then, I mean, perhaps we come back to that later, but coal is extremely important for steel, for cement, which are, of course, pillars of the industrial civilization, just to take the word of Václav Smil, right? So, I mean, it's really important to emphasize the fact that we live with old sources of energy. Another example would be wood. I mean, nowadays, you've got a third of the world population depending on wood to cook. Wood has expanded an enormous increase in the 1960s, especially in poor countries, but also in rich countries. And it's also connected to this symbiotic argument. I mean, to explain the rise of wood energy in the industry of rich countries, you have to take into account packaging. My book deals with stuff which are not considered, important by historians of tech, like packaging. But when you think about it properly, packaging is extremely important because they are, of course, everywhere. It's an enormous industry in terms of value. It's bigger than aviation, for instance.
Of course,
right?
The containers
And
also.
they are everywhere, and they are made of wood because they're made of cardboard, right? And the cardboard industry is an enormous consumer of wood energy. So you got a growing economy, which is fueled with coal and oil during the 20th century. So you got I mean, a bigger volume, a larger volume of goods to package. So you need more wood to produce these packages, and the cardboard industry, the paper industry, is dependent on wood energy. So you got with oil and coal, got a kind of side effect on the wood energy as well through packaging, right? And all these kind of connections are everywhere, all the time, happening all the time. Right?
It's true. Well, when I just said the containers is not because they are made of wood, but the importance of these dimensions that we normally don't focus.
Mm.
For example, the packaging or the transport. So there is a imperial route, we could say, in this scheme, and of transitions, thinking history as a transition, and the utility of these concepts in order to promote new dynamics of growth in terms of progress, in a way. When you put it in this side, it's easier to defend it. So in this point, I wanted to bring one element of your previous book, or it's not the previous one, I guess, from the événement de l'Anthropocène, where you say that from the 18th century to 1980, the Anthropocene is an Anglocene. Or could you
Okay,
comment?
yeah, this is from my previous book. Basically,
Yeah.
the point of the shock of the Anthropocene was to get the discourse of the Anthropocene out of the human species. You know, the talk about the human species. This was really the dominant way of framing the environmental issue, saying that this is a kind of the human species altering the earth. And in a way, this was this this demonstrated the influence of neo-Malthusian thinking on environmental issues. In Britain and in the US, the question of the growing human population has always been extremely important in the framing of environmental issues from the 1960s onwards, with major thinkers being neo-Malthusians, concerned by the growing population, especially in poor countries. And I think the Anthropocene is just one of the late progeny of this very peculiar way of framing environmental issues. So the point of the book was to say, no, we have to propose as historians a proper history of the Anthropocene, what really put us in the mess. And I mean, of course, the human demography is part of the equation, but certainly not the main part. And for instance, if you take capital, the amount of capital, it has grown much faster than the number of humans.
Yeah.
It's multiplied by 134 between 1800 and 2000. But the human population has been multiplied by only 7, right?
Totally.
And in the same way about the Anthropocene, it was the easiest point to make, actually. You look at CO2 emissions from Britain and the US, and until the 1970s, Britain and the US emitted, in terms of cumulative emission, they emitted more than the rest of the world. So that's why, talking about CO2 and Anthropocene would have been more rigorous than a very vague Anthropocene, right? So, all the book was based on this idea of refuting this neo-Malthusian vision of the environmental crisis, right?
Yeah, I wanted to bring it back because I guess that there is a continuity of anti-hegemonic discourse in your work. You are in that book, you work against the utility of this concept and this discourse of the Anthropocene, and now you shifted to the history of energy. It is no coincidence that the idea of the energy transition was promoted from the Anglo-Saxon sphere. For example, you have sometimes recalled US President Jimmy Carter's speech in 1977 when he said, "In the past, we have already made 2 energy transitions, from wood to coal and then from coal to oil. Now we have to make a 3rd transition." But this idea that one energy source replaces another is, as you show in the book, deeply misleading. How has the energy transition myth served to block or to marginalize other strategies to combat climate change?
Nowadays it clearly has this function. if I come back to the IPCC Group 3, it is true that the question of degrowth has not yet been studied by modelers because the key topic is transition. But it's a much more general pattern. If you read the declaration of politicians, major politicians nowadays, transition is a way of not talking about the level of production and therefore of not talking about redistribution, which should be key elements in our political discussion on climate change, around climate change. John Kerry, for instance, had the same kind of very strange version of history as Jimmy Carter. Recently, he said, what we have to do is an energy transition, which is like a new industrial revolution. I don't know what he has in mind. I mean, the material history of the Industrial Revolution is certainly not a good analogy to compare to what we have to do, obviously. But this is everywhere. I mean, this phasist, ageist vision of energy is really played a critical role in the making this idea of, yes, we're going to get out of fossil fuels in 2 decades with innovation. This wrong history has played a very potent ideological role, I think. So what I was interested in is this connection between history and politics and the politics of the history of energy in convincing us that, yes, in facing climate change, yes, we can entirely change the basis of industrial civilization in 2 or 3 decades. This is a very, very strong claim when you think about it properly, right?
Yeah.
So what is interesting with energy transition is that it plays different functions at each period of time. Nowadays, it is quite obvious that, yes, it plays a role of procrastination, of invoking dubious innovation as a way out of carbon. I mean, this is very obvious when you read in the newspaper, like intrinsically polluting companies, such as oil companies or aviation companies or airlines companies, saying that, of course, we will be net zero by 2050, when there is very little chance that all the technologies would be in place for aviation to be net zero by 2050. So, I mean, it makes obvious the fact that, of course, energy transition is the ideology of capitalism in the 21st century. It is the ideology of capitalism faced with climate change. But in the past, it did not necessarily had this role. I mean, in the case of Carter that you mentioned in your question, I mean, Jimmy Carter, when he said that in 1977, he was about to encourage the extraction of coal in the US. He wanted to double coal extraction by the next decade in the late 1970s. I mean, the reasoning was that oil was becoming scarcer, more expensive. So you had to extract more coal, and you could liquefy coal to make liquid fuel for cars and so on. So basically, in this case, energy transition was a way to give a kind of futuristic image to an energy plan, which was not particularly futuristic. It was based on returning to coal, basically, after a big period of domination of oil, right? So, and it worked. Just after his speech, the New York Times published that, the US and the world is on the first steps of a new energy transition, right? So it has many different political meaning. But like in the 80s, everybody was talking about energy transition already. And energy transition was already a kind of empty word, meaning that everything could be energy transition. Like a new pipeline could be part of the energy transition. The Reagan team, when Reagan was, of course, a candidate for the presidential election, had a group of people called the Energy Transition Team, and they were fostering the increase of oil extraction in Texas and elsewhere in the US. So energy transition was really the perfect word to talk about anything that would increase energy sovereignty, which was really the key motive of energy policy in the 1970s and 1980s. And energy transition was just a synonymous of any policy fostering energy sovereignty of the US. But like if you go back further in the past, it's not necessarily energy transition that was important, it's not the exact word, but this idea of a shift from one energy to another, it could have many different functions. Like in the bourgeois discourse on technology, late 19th century, there was an emphasis on the steam engine, where every progress depended on the steam engine, of the invention of James Watt, and it would squeeze the human muscle in production, in the discourse on production. Whereas, of course, the human muscle is absolutely crucial for the progress of the 19th century. I mean, without miners, you don't have coal, so you don't have steam, obviously. Without navies, you don't have roads, right? So you don't have trains and so on. So talking about, the centrality of steam was a way to marginalize the worker. In the late 19th century, there was a very strong discourse on a shift to electricity, especially among socialists in Britain, in the US. And it was a way to say that, in the future, electricity will be so important, it will be an enormous network that can only be managed by a strong state, or by a kind of collective organization, which is antithetical to capitalism, to liberal capitalism. So it was a way to critique liberal capitalism, to say that it's obsolete, right? Because we have this new form of energy. But this very crude kind of stagism has always produced bad history and probably not so good politics, right? So, and nowadays, this very crude stagism is really little because it gives the impression that, of course, we can shift from fossil fuels to renewables, and it's a new era of solar age and so on, but it's really very, very bad.
That was
Bad
my next question in this, how, like, if maybe we can focus in this last part of the interview on the so-called renewable energy transitions, like what kind of relations are you seeing? It's symbiotic relations or competitive relations between oil, for example, or fossil fuels and renewable energy?
I mean, both.
Both.
Yeah, I think in electricity production, renewables are very useful, and they are allowing a decrease in coal consumption in the next years, probably. So this is very good news, and we should not be so much concerned about the fact that, of course, I mean, to produce a solar panel, you need fossil fuel for the moment, but it's not a big deal. The important thing is, what will we do with all these renewable energies and renewable electricity? I mean, for example, in Texas, there is a huge boom in wind power, but this electricity is powering oil jack, right? So you've got all these sort of symbiotic relationship which are still happening, right? And if renewables are very good at producing electricity, they are not so good to produce key materials such as cement and steel that I already mentioned. And they are not so good as well in terms of agricultural production. I mean, we have to put renewables to their proper place, I think. Electricity is just 40% of CO2 emissions. And on this 40%, they will play a very important role. But there is all the rest, right? Where the renewables are not, they don't have such a big impact or not very fast. And so on all the rest, we have to talk about decrecimiento.
Yes.
Obviously, we have to talk about degrowth. This is very important.
Indeed.
And
yeah.
yeah.
No, that's the last point, if you are willing to speak about it, because I wanted to recover one, or to read one paragraph from your introduction that is quite clear and quite impressive, that is gonna let me to ask you the last question. You say, in the face of the climate crisis, we can no longer be content with a relative story, a transition, or history, but a transition to renewables that would see fossil fuels decline in relative terms, but stagnate in terms of tons would solve nothing. We can no longer be content with the vagueness of the transition and its myriad epithets, nor with the misleading analogies between the pseudo-transition of the past and the one we have to make today. The climate imperative does not demand a new energy transition, but a voluntary and huge energy self-amputation. what kind of political force can carry out these amputations, and to what extent can it be voluntary?
I don't know. I
Mm.
don't think that I get any political force able to really
Mhm.
have a serious policy on this issue. And to be honest, it's beyond historical imagination. It's what I explained in the conclusion. I mean, we don't
Mm.
have a good example to brandish to say that, okay, in the past, things have been done and we have to do something analogous. In a way, the book is really about yes, I mean,
Mm.
we have to be modest about what social sciences can provide as this drive for solutions. Um, what I emphasize is the fact that many authors arrive saying that yes, I've the solution to decarbonize, or read my book and there is the manual to exit fossil fuels, and I think this is really deeply misleading.
Mm.
Uh, I really want to emphasize the fact that the the way the climate problem has been established has relied on a wrong history. That's
Mhm.
really the key argument of the book. And in conclusion, I say, I mean, I think it's more honest to say that
Mm.
historians don't have any lessons to give on what we should do. But the point is, if scientists do not start talking about these issues of the
Mhm.
quantity of material that we produce, the quantity of infrastructure, the roads, and all these aspects, I mean, there will be no serious policy on on climate if we don't start talking about the level of production. That's what I really wanted to underline.
And I completely feel that this has been a huge intervention in these spaces, like, for example, the ecological movements. Even though we don't have the experience, therefore, we don't have the imaginations nor the solutions to fix it. I think that this critique against the transition scheme and how it's being used can provide a really critical tool in order to construct different ways of resistance and in order to immunize any movements, social movements implied against this kind of rhetoric. So, thank you so much, Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, first for the book, secondly for the interview, and to close, and before we say goodbye, I would like to make you a request that we make to all the guests. Who do you think we should interview to deepen our understanding of the actual struggle? It can be of the growth, energy. It doesn't necessarily have to be from your own field. Who would you
I mean,
recommend?
from my own field, I would strongly recommend a British historian of technology that I mentioned, David Edgerton, who has been a great influence for this book. His book Shock of the Old is really a key text in history of tech. I mean, it showed
Mm.
that we have very strange narrative on technology. We are obsessed with innovation. And of course, green innovation is part of the problem. I mean, this
Mm.
idea that we just have to innovate. I mentioned the role of economists, neo-Schumpeterian economists who have been very influential in the climate issue, who explain that to solve the climate issue, we just have to redirect the R&D, and we will decarbonize the economy without any pain. And all this is very seducing, especially for governments. And I mean, it's perfectly understandable, but this is really wrong. And this is really a bad Schumpeterian, neo-Schumpeterian vision of technology, which for the climate issue is leading us nowhere.
So, thank you so much again, Jean Baptiste.
You're welcome.